The sun barely crested the rugged, snow-draped peaks as the icy breath of winter whispered through the towering evergreens. A faint crunch of boots on frostbitten ground disrupted the serene silence, announcing the presence of someone deeply familiar with this wild, untamed expanse. Dr. Elena Maddox adjusted her wool-lined hat, her breath billowing in visible clouds as she made her way through the dense forest. For as long as she could remember, the wilderness had been her sanctuary. This wasn't just a place to work. It was where she felt most alive. Her mornings always began like this, a solitary walk at dawn, accompanied only by the occasional chirp of a brave winter bird or the distant call of a wolf pack. The wilderness had a rhythm, one she had spent years learning to hear and respect. Elena wasn't like most veterinarians. While her peers preferred the controlled environments of clinics, she thrived on the unpredictability of the wild. The Rocky Mountain Reserve, a sprawling sanctuary for endangered species, had been her home for the past decade. Over the years, she had earned a reputation for her unparalleled dedication to the animals she cared for, and an uncanny knack for understanding them. Today, however, something felt different. There was a weight in the air, a subtle tension that Elena couldn't ignore. As she reached the edge of a frozen creek, she paused, letting her senses take over. The faint rustle of leaves caught her attention, followed by the low, guttural groan of a bear. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but concern. "Not now," she muttered under her breath. It was far too early in the season for bear activity. Most should still be in the depths of their winter slumber. Gripping the tranquilizer rifle slung over her shoulder, Elena followed the sound, her boots crunching softly against the icy terrain. Her mind raced through possibilities. Injured? Starving? The latter seemed unlikely in this reserve, where food sources were carefully monitored. Whatever the reason, she had to find the bear before it was too late. Pushing through a thicket of branches, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, partially hidden beneath a rocky overhang, was a massive black bear. Its fur was matted with snow, and its breaths came in ragged puffs. But what truly stunned Elena wasn't the bear's condition. It was the 5 tiny cubs huddled close to her, their eyes barely open, their fragile bodies trembling against the cold. Elena's heart ached at the sight. 5 cubs. She had never seen anything like it. Bears typically had litters of 2 or 3, sometimes 4 if they were especially fortunate. But 5? It was a miracle and a challenge. The mother bear lifted her head weakly, her dark eyes locking onto Elena's. There was no aggression, only exhaustion, as if she knew Elena was her only chance. Elena had barely settled the mother bear and her cubs into the reserve's Wildlife Rehabilitation Center when the call came through. The sharp trill of her satellite phone echoed in the small clinic, cutting through the hum of heaters working overtime to keep the room warm. She grabbed it quickly, her pulse quickening as she saw the caller ID, Ranger Callum. He rarely called unless it was urgent. "Elena," his voice crackled over the line, heavy with tension. "We got a situation. A pack of wolves has strayed too close to the eastern boundary. Livestock on the neighboring ranch was attacked last night, and the ranchers are furious. They're threatening to take matters into their own hands." Elena's stomach sank. "What do you mean, take matters into their own hands?" "You know what I mean," Callum said grimly. "They're talking about trapping and shooting the pack. They've already got the permits lined up." The image of the wolf pack, sleek and powerful, flashed in her mind. She had tracked their movements through the reserve for years, studying their dynamics and marveling at their resilience. They were essential to the ecosystem, a keystone species that kept the balance in check. Without them, prey populations could spiral out of control, threatening not just the forest but the other animals that depended on it. "Callum, we can't let them do this," Elena said, pacing the room. "We need to find the pack and bring them deeper into the reserve, away from the boundary." "It's not that simple," he replied. "They've already killed 3 calves. The ranchers aren't going to wait for a resolution. They want results, and they want them now." Elena gritted her teeth. This wasn't the first time human-wildlife conflict had brought her to the edge of her patience, but it never got easier. The wolves were doing what wolves did, hunting to survive. The ranchers, however, saw them as threats to their livelihood. not as vital components of the ecosystem. It was a moral tug-of-war, and she was always caught in the middle. Her gaze drifted to the observation window. Inside, the mother bear lay curled protectively around her cubs, who squirmed and mewed softly. The vet staff had done all they could for her, treated her frostbite, administered fluids, and created a warm, quiet space for her family to recover. But she knew better than anyone that nature had its limits. If the wolves were eradicated, the delicate balance that allowed animals like this mother bear to thrive could crumble. "I'm coming out there," Elena said, her voice firm. "We'll track the pack and relocate them before anyone can do anything rash." "Elena, it's not just the wolves," Callum said, his voice dropping. "There's a storm moving in, a bad one. If you get caught out there—" "I don't have a choice," she interrupted. "I'll bring the tranquilizer equipment and the portable tracking gear. Meet me at the eastern boundary." The line went dead, and Elena stood for a moment, gripping the phone tightly. The storm Callum mentioned was no small matter. This region of the Rockies was notorious for sudden, violent blizzards that could reduce visibility to nothing in minutes. But the thought of losing the wolf pack and everything they represented was a risk she wasn't willing to take. Grabbing her gear, she hesitated as she passed the bear's enclosure. The mother stirred, her eyes flickering open briefly to meet Elena's. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her chest. Every decision she made here carried consequences, not just for the animal she fought to protect, but for the entire ecosystem she had dedicated her life to preserving. As she stepped out into the biting wind, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about wolves and ranchers. The storm wasn't just a physical threat. It was a symbol of the turbulence brewing between humanity and nature, a test of her resolve. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered if she was in over her head. The wind howled through the towering evergreens, carrying with it the sharp sting of ice and snow. Elena leaned into the gale, clutching her tracking equipment tightly as she trudged through the forest. Her breaths came in short, visible bursts, her cheeks stinging from the cold. The storm wasn't just approaching, it was already here. The forest around her felt alive, almost menacing. Branches groaned under the weight of heavy snow, and every distant crack or rustle sent her nerves on edge. She knew the wolves were out there, somewhere deep within the reserve, moving as one through the icy wilderness. But finding them before the ranchers made their move was a race against time and the elements. Her thoughts swirled like the snowstorm around her. The moral conflict she faced was nothing new, yet it weighed heavier than ever. She had chosen this life because she believed in the balance of nature, in the delicate dance between predator and prey. But what was she supposed to do when human interests collided so violently with the wild she had sworn to protect? She stopped to check her GPS. The wolves had been last sighted near a frozen stream that snaked along the reserve's boundary. If they were still in the area, she might be able to sedate and relocate them before the rancher's traps or bullets found them. But relocating an entire pack wasn't simple. It required precision, cooperation, and, above all, luck. Elena's mind flashed back to the mother bear and her cubs. That miraculous family was a reminder of what was at stake. Without predators like wolves, prey populations would boom, leading to overgrazed forests and barren landscapes. It was a cascade effect, one she had seen play out in other ecosystems. If the wolves were killed, the reserve could spiral out of balance for years to come. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant, mournful howl of a wolf. She froze, her heart pounding as the sound carried through the trees. The pack was close. She scanned the snow-covered ground for tracks, spotting faint paw prints leading deeper into the forest. They were fresh. Elena followed the trail, her senses heightened. The snow made every step treacherous, the uneven terrain threatening to send her tumbling. She was acutely aware of the storm's growing intensity. The wind whipped snow into her face, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. But she pushed forward, driven by the urgency of her mission. The prince led her to a clearing, where the forest gave way to a wide, frozen expanse. Her heart sank as she spotted the wolves. They were clustered together on the ice, their dark forms stark against the blinding white. The alpha, a massive gray male, stood at the forefront, his piercing yellow eyes scanning the horizon. The rest of the pack, a mix of adults and juveniles, huddled behind him, their breath visible in the frigid air. Elena crouched low, her hand hovering over the tranquilizer rifle slung across her back. She needed to act quickly, but carefully. Tranquilizing a wolf required precision. The wrong dose could be fatal, and she couldn't risk injuring or separating the pack. But as she prepared to make her move, a sound behind her made her blood run cold. A sharp crack split the air, followed by the unmistakable thud of boots on snow. She turned to see two men stepping into the clearing, rifles in hand. Ranchers. They hadn't waited for the storm to pass, or for anyone to intervene. Elena's heart raced as she straightened and stepped into their line of sight. "Stop," she called, her voice firm despite the wind. The men froze, their eyes narrowing as they spotted her. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, scowled. "You've got no business here, lady. These wolves killed our livestock." "I'm a wildlife veterinarian," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here to relocate the pack before anyone gets hurt, wolves or otherwise." "Relocate them," the man scoffed. "They'll just come back. Only way to solve this problem is to get rid of them for good." Elena's jaw tightened. She could feel the alpha's gaze on her, as if the wolf understood the danger they were in. The pack shifted nervously behind him, their low growls barely audible over the wind. "Killing them won't solve anything," she said, stepping forward. "If you wipe out this pack, you'll throw the entire ecosystem off balance. The prey population will skyrocket, and your livestock will face even more threats." The second man, younger and less sure of himself, glanced at his companion. "She's got a point, Bill. We don't want more problems down the line." Bill glared at Elena, his grip tightening on his rifle. "We can't afford to wait. The law's on our side." Elena took a deep breath, her mind racing. She needed to defuse the situation before it escalated. "Give me a chance," she said. "Let me relocate them. If they come back, I'll personally work with the reserve to strengthen the boundary. But killing them now will only make things worse." For a moment, the only sound was the howling wind. Finally, Bill lowered his rifle with a growl of frustration. "Fine, but you'd better move fast. If I see them near my ranch again, it's on you." Elena exhaled, relief flooding through her. She turned back to the wolves, who hadn't moved from their position on the ice. The alpha's gaze met hers, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a strange connection, a mutual understanding. She worked quickly, setting up the tranquilizer rifle and adjusting the dosage. The first shot hit the alpha cleanly, and he staggered before sinking to the ground. One by one, she sedated the rest of the pack, careful to keep them together. By the time she had loaded the last wolf onto the transport sled, the storm was in full force. The wind was nearly deafening, and visibility was down to a few feet. But as she secured the sled and began the arduous trek back to the reserve, she felt a sense of accomplishment. She had saved the wolves for now. Still, the moral dilemma lingered. The rancher's anger wasn't going away, and the storm had only postponed the inevitable clash between human interests and the natural world. As Elena pushed forward through the snow, she couldn't help but wonder, how long could she keep fighting this battle before something, or someone, gave way? The storm had reached its peak. The wind howled, bending the trees, and the snow fell in blinding sheets, reducing the forest to a swirling, white void. Elena stumbled through the thickening snow, her eyes squinting against the blizzard's bite. The transport sled was heavy, and every step felt like wading through thick mud, but the weight of what she had just done settled in her chest, far heavier than the equipment strapped to her back. The wolves were safely sedated, their breathing shallow but steady, but Elena couldn't shake the sense of urgency. She needed to get them back to the reserve safe zone before the sedation wore off. The alpha was already beginning to stir, a faint twitch of his ears beneath his thick fur, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. As she trudged forward, the howl of the wind seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the sound of her own thoughts. The rancher's words echoed in her mind. "If I see them near my ranch again, it's on you." They had made their ultimatum clear. But what did that mean for the future? The wolves would be relocated, this time, but the threat of violence would always hang over them. And as long as the ranchers felt their livelihood was at risk, that threat would remain. She reached a narrow ravine, the last natural barrier before the reserve's protected boundary. The trail ahead was perilous. Snow-covered rocks jutted out from the ground like teeth, and the wind had created treacherous drifts, making it impossible to navigate safely. The sled was getting heavier, and Elena could feel the sweat beading on her forehead beneath her layers, despite the cold. And then, in the middle of the ravine, she heard it. A sharp crack, like the snap of a twig, followed by a low growl. Her heart stopped. She swung around, scanning the area through the storm, but the dense snow obscured everything. For a moment, she thought it was just her imagination, until she heard it again. A figure emerged from the swirling white, its massive form gliding toward her through the storm. A wolf. No, not just one, a pack. Elena's breath hitched. The pack she had relocated had awakened early. The alpha she had sedated was up, and he was leading them back. Panic surged in her chest, but she quickly quelled it. These were the wolves she had saved. They weren't a threat. But what if the ranchers found them again? What if the same cycle repeated itself? She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the ranchers trailing her. But there was no sign of them. The storm, while violent, had created a window of safety for now. She was alone, and yet, Elena couldn't shake the fear that the wolves were not truly safe, neither in the reserve nor outside of it. As the pack approached, she could see the alpha's eyes, those piercing yellow eyes, and in them, she saw something she hadn't noticed before, a deep weariness, a wariness, as if he knew the danger that followed him. The pack stood silently, their heads low, the tension palpable. Elena took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. She could lead them deeper into the reserve, further away from human civilization, where they might have a chance to live in peace, at least for a while. But that meant separating them from their natural hunting grounds and risking their survival. There were no guarantees in the wild, and the reserve wasn't endless. The wolves would eventually need to return to the areas they had roamed, and the ranchers would be waiting for them. Or she could make the hardest choice of all, release them back to the wild, to the very land they had claimed, and risk their lives. She could try to convince the ranchers to coexist, to understand the bigger picture of the ecosystem. But deep down, Elena knew the truth. There was no easy answer, no safe haven. Her hands shook as she reached for the tranquilizer rifle, her fingers numb with cold. But before she could make a decision, a sharp cry echoed through the ravine. The mother bear. She had woken up, no doubt sensing the wolves' presence. The sound was urgent, laced with fear. Elena's heart tightened. She turned back to the wolves, their eyes tracking her movements. The alpha stepped forward, almost as if he understood. The choice was no longer hers alone. She wasn't just a protector of the wolves. She was the keeper of the balance. The decision was bigger than any one animal. It was about survival, not just for one species, but for all. With a deep breath, Elena lowered the rifle, her gaze softening. The wolves had been through enough. The mother bear had made it clear. The wilderness had a right to reclaim its own. She couldn't keep fighting the inevitable. She stood up straight, her legs trembling with exhaustion, and let the wolves pass. The alpha glanced back at her once more, his eyes filled with something that could have been gratitude. He led the pack into the forest, their shapes melting into the blizzard. Elena watched them disappear, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She knew there were no guarantees, that tomorrow might bring more danger, more conflict. But in that moment, standing alone in the ravine, she realized something. Nature wasn't just about preserving the balance. It was about trusting it, even when it seemed impossible. She turned her back to the storm and started walking again, her pace slow, her mind still processing what she had just done. But as the wind stung her face, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. There were no perfect choices, only the next step in a long journey. And for today, that step had been the right one. The storm began to break as Elena made her way back to the reserve's boundary. The wind slowed, and the heavy curtain of snow lifted enough for the trees to emerge from their frozen haze. It was a quiet, still moment, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to find her footing. Elena's legs were heavy, her muscles aching from the strain of the trek. The tranquilizer rifle felt like an unnecessary weight now, like a reminder of the choice she had just made. The wolves were out there, somewhere in the depths of the forest, moving freely once more. She didn't know what would happen to them next, but for the first time in hours, her mind felt calm. The mother bear and her cubs were safe in the rehabilitation center, recovering from their ordeal, and the immediate crisis had been averted. But something had shifted within Elena during those moments of decision. The weight of responsibility she had carried for so long, the constant balancing act between human demands and the raw, unpredictable pulse of nature, had lightened. She couldn't control everything. No one could. As she approached the reserve's main cabin, a figure emerged from the doorway. Callum, his face partially obscured by the storm's remnants, but his presence unmistakable. His sharp gaze softened when he saw her approach. "Elena," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken questions. "You did it, didn't you?" She nodded, finally allowing herself a small breath of relief. "I did. The wolves are free, at least for now." Callum studied her for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "You know the ranchers won't stop. It won't be easy." "I know," she replied. "But maybe it doesn't have to be about stopping them. Maybe it's about helping them understand why the wolves and everything else matter." Callum nodded, seeming to accept her words. They stood in silence for a moment, the storm quieting around them, the sound of their own breathing the only thing that seemed real. As Elena watched the sky clear above, she felt a quiet transformation within herself. She had always believed in the cause, but today she had come to realize that true growth, whether in nature or within herself, came from accepting the uncertainties. It wasn't just about protecting life. It was about giving it the freedom to grow, to change, to find its own way. And in that quiet, fragile moment, Elena understood. Sometimes the hardest thing wasn't deciding what to do. It was letting go of what you thought was in your control.